I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight. This is the fourth, I believe, or fourth presentation for the Created Equal program series. Created Equal, America's Civil Rights Struggle is made possible through a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of its Bridging Cultures initiative, in partnership with the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. Tonight's presenter is Grady Atwater, the site administrator for the John Brown Museum in Osawatomie, Kansas. I would like to welcome Mr. Atwater to the podium.
I appreciate you inviting me. Thank you. And today we are going to talk about one of the pioneers of the civil rights movement, John Brown. And he is also one of the most controversial historical figures in American and world history. And he has become, over time, a philosophical symbol of ideologically related action. And one of the interesting things is that an indicator of how well known he is we have visitors literally at the John Brown Museum from all over the world. One of the interesting things they'll do is I'll start to give the basic story about John Brown, and I'll have someone from France or Germany or Japan look at me and go, "We know that, we want details." So we're talking about an internationally known historic figure. Now, part of the question is, who is John Brown? Or who was John Brown? And John Brown was an abolitionist who was born in Torrington, Connecticut on May 9, 1800. He was reared in Hudson, Ohio. Now, the reason I mention that is that Hudson, Ohio was an abolitionist community. So much so that around the 1830s and 40s, when there was a string of slaves escaping across the Ohio River and up into Ohio, and the Underground Railroad had major stations in Hudson, there was a sign that a frustrated slaveholder put up. Put a caricature of an African American, and it had "This is the way to Hudson" out there to put the town down. The town took pride in it and didn't take it down for 10 years. Now, John Brown was reared in Hudson, Ohio by Owen Brown and Ruth Mills Brown to begin with, but unfortunately Ruth Mills Brown died in childbirth in 1808. After that, the maternal figure in his life was Sally Ruth Brown, John Brown's second wife. Now, it's important to note this about Owen Brown, because a family is a soil in which people grow. And John Brown was taught from birth to be an abolitionist in an abolitionist community. This was not something that was accidental. It was something that his parents inculcated into him. His neighbors inculcated it into him. Everybody in the community inculcated it into him. So this was something literally from birth that he was educated about. He was taught slavery is wrong. We don't believe in slavery. So what happened, as John Brown grew up, Owen Brown was a devout Christian Calvinist. Now we have to note that, and that's very important. And I'm bringing this up right in the beginning, because that Christian belief made up his primary motivation in life. That Calvinist thing. Now, of course, Calvinism is something that people study all their lives, and you fill libraries up with. So I'm going to give you the part that matters with John Brown. Owen Brown taught his son, and the church that he went to taught his son, the Calvinist church that he went to taught him, that all people, men and women, were equal in the eyes of God, and that slavery and racism was a sin against God and man. Now, this is revolutionary at the time, radical, to teach your children that all people are equal, in a time when even the most devout of Christians believed racism was the order of the Bible and order of God in churches, and life was segregated. The second point to understand about John Brown is that Owen Brown taught him that Christians, and this is probably the most important part that led to John Brown being active, that Christians were God's arm on earth. And here's the way it worked. If you as a Christian, you were walking down the street and you saw somebody doing something wrong, someone attacking someone, someone mistreating someone, if you did not stop to do anything about it, when you died and your soul went to heaven and you knelt before the Lord would look at you and go, you were as guilty as that man or that person who was doing the evil act. And this was drummed into John Brown's head. Don't just sit on your hands, do something. One of my favorite quotes about John Brown was he said, some abolitionists need to have their tongues cut out so they'll be forced to do something. Because he was very impatient with people who just talked and did not do anything to end slavery. So, that's a very important thing to know about John Brown. That's one of his primary motivations. And he was inculcated with this. This was made a part of his psychological and spiritual being. Raised in church. Went to church on Sunday night, Wednesday. Bible study daily in their home. So he was taught that Christianity taught that slavery was wrong. Now, in addition to this, Owen Brown's home was a station on the Underground Railroad, and John Brown assisted his father in helping to hide slaves. Now, one of the things that feeds racism is ignorance. Let's put it that way. It's just a reality. Very often, because African Americans were segregated away from whites, and whites had no real experience interacting with African Americans, they tended to believe things that were false about them, because they had no experience otherwise. John Brown, on the other hand, was raised in a home that was a station on the Underground Railroad. He helped feed slaves. He helped hide slaves. He got to know what African Americans were really like and found out they were human, intelligent, equal beings in his experience. So that is something to understand. John Brown had experience with African Americans. But even at that, as he was raised in Hudson, Ohio, you know, your parents tell you something, yeah, you have the experience with the slaves, but something happened when he was 12 years old in 1812 that firmed all this up. Now, Owen Brown was a businessman. And one of the ways you did business back then was you got government contracts, just like people get government contracts today. You want to get that government contract. And he got a government contract to provide a herd of 100 head of cattle to the United States Army that was then fighting up north of him in Ohio and Michigan. And so John Brown drove that 100 head of cattle through the wilderness in the middle of winter time, and he finally got to a house of a man who was a United States Marshal. He said, so the United States Marshal particularly impressed this 12-year-old. Look what maturity that this young man has. He can drive this herd of cattle through the wilderness, which was no mean feat. So he took him into the house and was praising him up and down, and then John Brown noticed that there was an African-American slave, his own age. And this slave was abused and beaten. And at one point, John Brown was horrified to see him. The owner picked up a ash shovel and beat this slave mercilessly with it. Now, this created a bisect. All of a sudden, the teachings of his parents, the people in his community, were met with reality. And he saw the reality of slavery. And it turned him into even more of a firm abolitionist, though by now he was still a peaceful abolitionist. Now John Brown is, people ask me, was he a minister? And I look at him and I go, yes, kind of. He trained to be a minister when he was 16 years old. The problem was that he had to abandon his studies for two basic reasons. One, because he developed an eye infection, which kind of bothered him the rest of his life. So, I'm going to explain those pictures you see, where that right eye, was this eye here looks a little wild. That's partially due to that. And he had to quit. He ended his studies. But that didn't end his studies of the Bible. He had the Bible, cover to cover, committed to memory. Committed to memory. Virtually, you named a book, he could say, a verse, he could quote it to you. So his faith was extremely strong. Now, in adulthood, John Brown trained for the John Brown had a variety of occupations. Now, this is where people ding John Brown. And I'm just going to say, well, John Brown was a failure at everything he did. He was a failure. Well, here's the reality of it. This was before the days when you had to have formal education to do things, and you had to have licenses and certifications and training to these things. That's the product of the progressives, the early 19th century. In the 1830s, 1820s and 1830s, here's what you did. You went to your library and you got a book, and you read the book. Say if you wanted to be a surveyor, you read a book on surveying, got some surveying equipment, and showed up and said, "Hello everybody, I'm a surveyor." And if you did, if you knew what you were doing, congratulations, you're a surveyor. You know, Abraham Lincoln himself never went to law school. He went into a law office, and somebody, the lawyer who trained him said, "Read that pile of books." He says, "Now there are 3 law schools in the United States, and there's thousands of lawyers." He said, "Do you think they all went to law school?" They didn't. So, very basically, what would happen in the 19th century was, very often, people would just try things and fail miserably. But they didn't know until they tried. And then they would move on and try something else. So if you're going to ding John Brown by calling him a failure, you have to call half the population of the United States at that time a failure. So therefore, that basically, John Brown did have numerous occupations. He was a tanner, he was a surveyor, he was a land speculator, what we would call a real estate investor. And multiple occupations. But there was one occupation that dominated his mind, and that was being an abolitionist working to end slavery. He once stated that he entered no occupation that he could not, no business deal or occupation he could not end in 2 weeks if he had to go do something for the abolitionist cause. Now, John Brown married Diane Lusk Brown on June 21st, 1820, and she bore him 7 children. She died in childbirth in Crawford County, Pennsylvania. You can go see her grave, as a matter of fact. It's still preserved. I've seen it, as a matter of fact. It's quite touching. And John Brown married his second wife, Mary Day Brown, in 1833, who bore him 13 children. Wow. Now, Mary Day Brown survived John Brown, and she lived to be 68, which for the time was quite a long life. Now, one thing to keep in mind about having 20 children, most people kind of gasp at that, That was not unusual for the day with a high infant mortality. The world was a much different place than it is now. Most people died around 40, 45 years old. So once a woman was able, once a teenage girl, about 14 or 15, had gone through puberty and was able to have children, boom, get married, start having your babies. Different world. So when I try to explain that to teenagers, sometimes they just kind of curl their noses up, you know, just to realize it. Because the only thing, the concept of teenager was invented during World War II. You were a child, then you were an adult. And before that. So therefore, John Brown's wives certainly deserve mention because they supported him. Mary Day Brown, she lived a long life, was a supporter of Brown. But one of the things to understand about the tragedy of this is with the high infant mortality, 9 of John Brown's children died before they reached adulthood. One time in Crawford County, Pennsylvania, there was a cholera epidemic and they killed 4 of his children within 2 weeks. And one of the most heart-rending things that you'll ever read is the description that was written by one of his family members, I think John Brown Jr., that because of the animals digging up the grave, what he was forced to do was bury his children out in the woods and then ride over the grave with his horse to disturb the ground so that animals wouldn't dig them up. This is the sort of tragedy that John Brown stoically and John Brown's wives stoically endured. Now, John Brown was a peaceful abolitionist for most of his life, till he was 37, as a matter of fact. He worked on the Underground Railroad peacefully, and he even proposed forming a school for former slaves to his brother Jeremiah in 1834. Now, the frustrating thing that Brown felt was the frustration began to build in a lot of abolitionists who began to look and they began to see that slavery, that abolitionists, they would go to meetings and they would sit down, oh yeah, everybody clap their hands, say we need to end slavery, and then go home and do absolutely nothing. And, you know, when it came time to do something practical, they would just, you know, they would come up with excuses. Well, we can't do that. Law, you know, what are we going to do? And a group of abolitionists split off and started to become militants. And they became of the opinion that slavery would never be ended except by violence. Now, as a matter of fact, one time in 1848, John Brown had Frederick Douglass over to his home. And as he had Frederick Douglass over to his home, they were having dinner. And John Brown got a map out. And he outlined in 1848 his plan at Harpers Ferry. And now Frederick Douglass was a former slave. And he knew the reality of slavery, and he knew what slaves would really do. And he tried to talk him out of it then. He said, you're not going to get anywhere because they're not going to risk their lives unless they absolutely know that it's going to work. And can't we find a peaceful way to do this? And John Brown looked over at Frederick Douglass and he said this. He says, of slaveholders, he says, I know their proud hearts. The only thing they understand is a big stick about their heads. And he wasn't alone in this, but he's the militant abolitionist that we know about the most. So, John Brown became a militant abolitionist because of an incident in Alton, Illinois in 1837. And it was the triggering action that caused him to become a militant. Elijah Lovejoy published a newspaper that he first published in St. Louis, but pro-slavery mobs attacked his publishing office, threw his print to the Missouri River and his typeset in the Missouri River and said, no, we took care of him. Well, Elijah Lovejoy was an abolitionist. He wasn't about to back down. So what he did was he bought another printing press, started over. They destroyed the second printing press, threw it in the river. Said, now, Reverend Lovejoy, stop that. So Reverend Lovejoy moved across the river to Alton, Illinois. He started a third paper. And the same mob came up. And this time, Alton, this time, Reverend Lovejoy wasn't backing down. They tried to set the building on fire. That didn't smoke him out. Then at a certain point, they burst into the warehouse where he was publishing his newspaper, and Reverend Lovejoy stood his ground and pointed a pistol at the mob coming at him, and they shot him dead. Now, what this did was it spread anger throughout, and emotion throughout the abolitionist community. Now they're attacking us. They've killed one of our own. And they began having memorial services all through the North. And they had one in Hudson, Ohio. I've literally been to where the site of that original church was. And at the end of the prayer service and the memorial service for Reverend Lovejoy, John Brown stood up in the back of the sanctuary, and he raised his hand and he said, I, John Brown, dedicate my life to the destruction of slavery. Later on, he enlisted his family in this crusade, and that marked the real beginning of his militant abolitionist crusade. Now, in 1848, John Brown moved his family to a farm near North Elba, New York, to help African Americans. Now, John Brown had a group called the Secret Six. And what this Secret Six did was it backed him financially, and it gave him political support. And Jared Smith was one of those Secret Six. And what Jared Smith did was he was a very rich man. A lot of the abolitionists were very wealthy, Northerners, who owned 148,000 acres in the Adirondack Mountains. So what he did was he set it aside for free and escaping slaves. And the thing was, he was going to pull a trick on the racist whites who tried to keep blacks from voting by making a property requirement. You had to own 250 acres of land in New York State to be able to vote. So he gave all these slaves 250 acres worth of land. Now, the whites in the area did not like this. The racist people did not like this at all. So what they began to do was they began to discriminate against them, cheat them out of their land. The local law enforcement and lawyers didn't treat them well, and John Brown heard about it, and he went up to Jared Smith and he says, I know how to help these people, and I will help these people. And so John Brown bought a small farm near North Elba, and he set up, and he said he would help them in court, and he would help them set up their farms and show them how to farm in the north. And this was a peaceful venture. If you visit that farm, it's now in a New York State Historic Site, you won't find much mention of violence because there was virtually none. He was still working in the peaceful way. But he was still a militant. And after that, in 1850, he formed what was called the United States League of Gileadites. And this was in response to probably the most unfair law that was ever passed in American history, called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And once you start describing this, you can tell this was a very unfair law. The way this worked was that slave hunters could walk up to any African American on the street, grab them, and say, you're an escaped slave. Now at this point, the African American, whether they had ever been a slave at all, had no right to defend themselves in court or any other way. They were taken before a special judge, and they could not hire a lawyer. No one could stand up and defend them at all. And the judge got $5 if he denied the slave hunter's claim, and $10 if the slave was returned to slavery. And now what infuriated people even more was if you were standing, if say an African American was standing here in the room and someone came in to take them and they said, help me tie this slave up, and we refused to do it, we would be arrested for failing to help the slaveholder. And given paid a fine and be even put in prison for that. Yet John Brown stated that has made more abolitionists than in all the speeches that anyone's ever made, because it outraged people. And John Brown formed a group called the United States League of Gileadites. And we have one of the daggers in the John Brown Museum that he gave them. But he got 50 daggers, and he said, you are Americans, and you have the right to defend yourself if someone tries to kidnap you and put you in slavery. And he said, use these knives to defend yourselves. Now, fortunately, in Springfield, Massachusetts, it was a northern town, and slaveholders didn't dare set foot in it, so they never had to do it. But it illustrates that John Brown in 1850 was willing to fight. Now we get to Kansas. History does not happen in a vacuum. And one of the things you have to understand is before you get to A, you get to point C, you have to go through A, B, and C. When John Brown came to Kansas, and one of the reasons John Brown came to Kansas was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Now, this Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 was due to the political ambitions of Stephen Douglas, who was an Illinois senator who wanted to be president in 1856. The big issue of the day was not whether slavery should exist or not, but whether slavery should spread into the new territories. People in the North did not want it to. People in the South said, my slave is my property and I can take my slave wherever I want to. Well, Douglas said, I'm going to be the guy who gets elected because I'm going to solve the big issue. So what he did was, he crafted a law. Now, it's 28 pages long, so I won't make it to it. And I read it, so I'll just give you the important part. The important part was something called popular sovereignty. And that is that people would vote whether slavery should exist in the new territories. Sounds democratic. What a good idea. Except for the fact that no one was willing to actually be democratic about it. What happened was, when the Kansas border was open, people from Missouri, in the first elections, people from Missouri, pro-slavery people from Missouri and all over the South came boiling into Kansas, and they went into areas of Kansas. For instance, there was one area that had 60 eligible voters, and they posted 6,000 votes. Well, the Free State people said, no way. And then they started recruiting people to move into Kansas to found towns. Osawatomie was one of them. And you can go throughout southeast Kansas, you can find them all over that were founded by Thayer would be one that was founded. It was named after Eli, after an abolitionist. But what happened was, very basically, guerrilla war broke out between pro and anti-slavery settlers. Towns would form. You would have a pro-slavery town form, and then a few miles away, the Free State people would say whether it would counter it with a Free State town. Guerrilla warfare, and I mean vicious, cruel guerrilla warfare, broke out. People were afraid to speak to each other because if a Southern accent came out to the wrong person, they would, guns would come out and people would be shot. John Brown's sons came into this environment because Reverend Samuel Adair and his wife Florilla, who were missionaries for the American Missionary Association, who were an abolitionist organization, came to Osawatomie, Kansas, and bought a cabin that had previously been built. And they moved into this cabin and began operating a station on the Underground Railroad and wrote back home. It's called chain migration. And John Brown's sons had basically gone broke in Ohio. And they wanted two reasons they came out here. One was to make a new start, and one was to make sure that Kansas would be a free state. So they moved out here and found themselves under attack. So John Brown Jr. wrote a letter to his father. He said, "Father, we need guns more than anything else. Will you please bring us guns? Well, you need to tell a militant that once." And so what he did was, he literally started out from North Alabama. Now, John Brown, you have to understand, was a gifted speaker. Gifted. He could get up in front of a crowd and have people in tears. And he stopped in Cleveland, Ohio. He stopped in every abolitionist town that he could, and he got up and he talked about the crimes against Kansas. Now the abolitionists need to stand and fight, and he got money and he got a wagon load of weapons. And so one day he rumbled up in front of the Adair cabin with a wagon full of Indians. Reverend Adair walked out. He looked under the tarp. No. Because Reverend Adair was a peaceful abolitionist. Well, what happened? John Brown quickly became a leader in the militant abolitionist movement. And Osawatomie was a flashpoint because a lot of militant abolitionists wrote in and out of Osawatomie. This created a situation where you had conflict not only between the pro-slavery people and the anti-slavery people, you had conflict between the peaceful abolitionists and the militant abolitionists going on. Because the militant abolitionists said, "You're fools if you think that there's anything but fighting going to win the day here." The peaceful abolitionists said, "Whoa, what we're going to do is we're going to out-settle them and outvote them. And if you just wait and don't use violence, we'll get enough support that what will happen is that slavery will go away." That, you can hear that later in the 60s between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Same argument. Because the peaceful abolitionists basically had a plan. What they wanted to do was they wanted to basically outpopulate every state in the West with abolitionists and just basically put a wall between on the Mississippi River of free state states. Let me tell you why that plan. Because they understood Southern agriculture. Because Southern agriculture was huge, massive plantations. And they would plant the same crop over and over until they exhausted the soil. And plantations were would move west. And they had hit the Mississippi. And they thought, if we can stop it in Missouri, we can stop it, we can sit down, we can kill slavery without firing a shot. Because if they can't move their plantations, they won't need slaves. Now, that required time. If you're an impatient militant abolitionist, as they used to say in the 60s, the slow change, they didn't want that. So, conflict broke out, guerrilla warfare, all over the state of Kansas, all over the territory of Kansas. Now, one thing when you're talking about John Brown, what he's going to be known for is the Osawatomie Massacre. I always address this because it's the one thing that everyone tends to know about. What happened was, and I'll put it in a nutshell because you can go, this is one of those things that people have studied and written 300-page books about. What happened was that pro-slavery forces in the process of guerrilla warfare had killed 5 free state men in a particularly vicious fashion. Now this gets swept under the rug, folks. When you talk about pro-slavery, you all hear about John Brown's violence. You don't hear about pro-slavery violence. Let me tell you a story. And this actually happened. There was a gentleman named Fugate. He was a pro-slavery guerrilla fighter. He was playing cards up in Leavenworth one time with his buddies. And they said, I'll bet you I can come back in an hour with an abolitionist scout. Oh, no, you can't. Shoegate, you can't do that. So he says, I'll bet you I can. So he rode out of Leavenworth and ran into some poor, unfortunate German immigrant who had just taken his wife to Lawrence and was coming back. He pulled his pistol, shot the man out of his wagon, and while he was still alive, scalped him. Left him there to die. Rode into Leavenworth, got a pole, put the scalp up on the pole. See, pay up, I did it. There was another unfortunate German in the store there at Leavenworth who said that's terrible, that he should do that. There were some pro-slavery guerrillas there that pushed him out on the street and shot him 10 times in the back. Now stuff like that gets swept under the rug. People don't know about that. That's what John Brown was responding to with the Osawatomie massacre. So what he did was, what had happened was that the pro-slavery forces had raided Lawrence because, and they had ridden, this is before Quantrell, and they had gone in and burned the Free State Hotel, and the peaceful abolitionists, whose strategy was to be the law-abiding folk, were not going to be the violent ones, let them be the violent ones, and backed off and let them do it. The militants gathered, most of them from Osawatomie, said, we've got somebody in this group has got to do something. As they're handing the list of people who are on the death list to John Brown, because they know he's the man who's probably going to do something. So he took 7 men along Osawatomie Creek. He pulled 5 men who had made death threats and other types of threats against Free State men in the area out of their cabins and had his men kill them with artillery swords. Now what you're going to hear is that John Brown purposely had them go cut their throats and split their skulls open, cut their arms off. If you do some real good research and you read the letters actually by the people of Solomon Brown, they don't deny the fact that they did it, but they do admit they did not know how to use a sword. See, you have to be trained to use these things. There's no pretty way to tell this part of the story. There is a militarily efficient way to cut someone's throat. They had no idea how to do it. So they made the mistake of taking the men and throwing them to the ground. Well, the men did what you or I would do. Rolled, they kicked, they fought. And Brown's men had to hack at them. So while I'm not excusing the violence on any level, I'm saying that it was not done out of any particular cruelty, it was done out of military ignorance on the part of Brown's men. Well, the Osawatomie massacre had the effect John Brown was looking for. To quote Solomon Brown, John Brown's son, one of the people who were in it put a constraining fear on the people who were making threats against Free State men in the area and showed that we could fight. This led next to the Battle of Blackjack, where John Brown, this was near Baldwin, you can visit this site, particularly interesting site, where John Brown and his men tricked. John Brown had around 24 men and he tricked a force twice his size that was sent out to capture him, commanded by a man named H.C. Pate, into surrendering. The way they did it was, if you go up to the site, and I recommend it because it's maintained real well, 2 creeks come together, and John Brown, on the morning of June 1st, he popped up, he went and he had his men sneak up on the force, 24 men, and there were around 100 men in the force that he was going up against. And he said, now here's what you do. He says, oh, don't fire from the same spot twice. Pop up and run to another spot. Pop up, run to another spot. He says, and told the men on the horses in the back, make a whole bunch of noise like there's a whole bunch of us. So H.C. Pate and his men woke up. I thought they were being attacked by around 400 men. Now, after about 3 hours, about an hour or so, about 3 hours, he comes out with a flag, we surrender, we're outnumbered. And John Brown, and what had happened in the 24 had gone down to 9 men. 9 men stood up. Oh, got to shout pro-slavery high. Their pride was hurt. They'd been tricked by some Yankee. So what happened was, they had to catch John Brown. And that led to the Battle of Osawatomie. John Brown Memorial Park is the site of the Battle of Osawatomie. And so this was John Brown's turn to be tricked. 1,200 men were dispatched, led by David Rice Atchison, to capture John Brown. 1,200, that's how badly they wanted John Brown. So they led those 1,200 men into Kansas. John Brown knew they were coming, and all men from Lawrence and men from all over went to Osawatomie and were standing there. They were ready to fight. Well, David Rice Atchison found out how many men. There were several hundred men at Osawatomie. Well, we don't want that big of a battle. Let's pull a trick on John Brown. They peeled off toward Lawrence, got near Ottawa, and all of a sudden, they're attacking Lawrence again, and all the men from Lawrence left, and everybody went to defend Lawrence. John Brown relaxed. He sent all his men home. And as David Rice Atchison's men were riding north toward Lawrence, he looked back to a man named John Reed, and he says, now go attack Osawatomie and get John Brown. Take 250 men with you. Pretty smart move. He said, come in from the west, because and pose as a free state call. John Brown fooled us, we'll fool him. And they did. Because what happened was that complete surprise. Reverend Samuel Adair was sitting in the Adair cabin, and his daughter heard a shot, because Frederick Brown, John Brown's son, had been shot through the heart by advanced scouts. He went and sent his son, Frederick, his son Charles, to warn John Brown. Now John Brown took a stand in what is now John Brown Memorial Park, and he was outnumbered 4-1 once again. Now his plan was, like any guerrilla fighter was, to take a strong stand, then retreat and lead Reed's men away from Osawatomie. Now as he did, but the problem was Reed's men were guerrillas too, and now they kind of had Brown's number, and they weren't doing it because as Brown's men retreated, they got to the river, and instead of following him, they went in and burned the town down. They left 3 buildings standing. Now, if you ever read in history books where John Brown is known as Osawatomie Brown, it is because of his stand at that battle, at the Battle of Osawatomie. Now, following that, John Brown fought the Battle of the Spurs near Holden. What's particularly interesting about this battle is John Brown used his reputation because he knew it had preceded him. He was taking 11 slaves in 1858 up north in Canada in the middle of winter. They got to Soldier Creek north of Holden. And they started, and it was flooded and swollen, and about 70 or 80 pro-slavery guerrilla fighters says, we got him. He can't go anywhere. He can't cross the creek. Let's hold him here till we can get him on the other side. We've got John Brown. Well, John Brown looked at his men and he says, men, line up. Put the slaves in the wagons. And he just charged them into the swollen creek. And they thought, this guy's crazy. He's charging us. He must be crazy. And they scattered. And that's why they call it the Battle of the Spurs. Simply because John Brown was a good enough guerrilla fighter to know when to take a stand and when not to. Now, what followed that was, now we're going to jump a little bit and go to the Harpers Ferry raid. Most people are familiar with that to a certain degree. John Brown, beginning on roughly October 16th to October 18th, raided Harpers Ferry, Virginia. His plan was to raid the National Arsenal, gather slaves up to his base, go up and establish guerrilla bases in the Appalachian Mountains, and come out and raid and free so many slaves that the South would have to give up slavery. Now that's in a nutshell. I'm doing a lot in a nutshell tonight. hope I stimulate more interest in reading, because this is something you can study for a lifetime, and I have. Well, the problem was that John Brown waited a bit too long. Because one of John Brown's faults was, if he had a plan, well, he was a bit of a control freak, and he was going to see it through. He waited too long, and him and his men were captured or killed. And he was put on trial. And at his trial, that's where John Brown shone. He looked around, and he saw reporters ready to write things down. And he said, okay. And he gave speeches, and people were, this is great stuff. This guy's a genius. These got published in northern papers and passed around through abolitionists. And all of a sudden, John Brown, they began having, worship services in this honor of this great man who was willing to risk it all for the freedom of the slaves. What a great abolitionist, what a great man. Now in the South, they began to note this. The fire eaters, people who wanted to have secession, and people who thought that the South should separate from us, said, see what we've been saying. We've been saying this for years. We need to separate. See, they celebrate this man who invaded our sacred soil, killed our people. And they celebrate him. So John Brown's raid helped to spark, on Harpers Ferry, helped to spark the Civil War, because the South began to arm themselves after that. Now, one of the questions that people ask, and it's at the John Brown Museum, and it's about the third one, was John Brown crazy? Was he insane? Well, my answer to that as an historian is, we really can't know unless we exhume John Brown, have a psychiatrist examine him, and we can't know for absolute sure whether he was or not. We can't say he was obsessed with ending slavery. Well, we can't say whether he was crazy or not with any certainty. That's a matter of opinion. But I can tell you the origin of the John Brown was crazy philosophy. The origin of that was that John Brown believed in the equality of African Americans and whites and was willing to fight and die for them, sacrifice his life for what whites considered to be inferior beings. And people said, this guy's got to be insane. Only an insane person would do such a thing. And that's the origin of that. Now, was John Brown violent? Certainly. You can't deny that John Brown was violent. No historian can. Was John Brown as violent as he's portrayed? No. John Brown, here's what would happen with John Brown. If you look at pictures of John Brown when he was in Kansas and pictures when he was in back east, he's very benevolent looking back east. He has suits on, and he looks like a grandfather. Here, he looks like, don't mess with me. His eyes are squinty, don't mess with me. Well, that's because he was a guerrilla fighter. And the one place that a guerrilla fighter wants you to be the most scared of him is right between your ears. The best example I can give of that is if I say we take this room here and we kill the lights, and I tell you there's a copperhead loose. Now, if you know anything about snakes, realistically, it's going to go in the corner away from us because, it doesn't. But on the other hand, and it may be about that big, but in our minds, the copperhead's going to be about this big and have big red eyes and want to eat us alive after a while, which is exactly what a guerrilla fighter wants you to think. Guerrilla groups are usually pretty weak when they have to face a real military force, which is why they don't usually do that. They strike in the dark, they strike quick, and they run. But you want people to think that. So what would happen is John Brown would enter a county or area, and all of a sudden, everything that went wrong was John Brown's fault. Every crime, every time a horse ran off, every time a barn caught on fire, it was John Brown. Which is exactly what John Brown, as a guerrilla fighter, had in mind. Which is what you want as a guerrilla fighter. He had everybody right here, which is why in Holton at the Battle of the Spurs, all he had to do was charge. Here comes the mean John Brown. Let's get out of here. Even though all they could have done is open fire, no more John Brown. A good example of that image that Brown had, just another quick example, was after the Battle of Blackjack, John Brown had camped with 28 prisoners on an island in Middle Creek, north of Ottawa. Woke up to find himself surrounded by federal troops. And the federal marshal had a warrant for his arrest. Not anybody else. Ooh. I quit. John Brown. John Brown got up, walked up to the commander, and he said, Colonel Sumner, he said, we are at war and you are interfering. Now, of course, this would surprise everybody. Really? And so, Sumner rolls his eyes a little bit, and he goes, I.P. Donaldson was the marshal, and he says, you have a warrant for this man's arrest, don't you? Now, once again, anybody else would throw their hands up. But John Brown turned to the marshal, more or less said, try arresting me. And the marshal says, well, I don't know, I can't find it all of a sudden. I don't have it. and so this is an example of how John Brown used that psychological ability of his to basically impress that he was meaner than he actually was. Now, John Brown was certainly no saint. He was a control freak. It was John Brown's way or no way. One time, he was in camp here in Kansas Territory. What happened was that the rest of the people in the camp wanted coffee. He wanted tea. So we stood and argued with him. He says, we want coffee, and I want tea. At a certain point, he went and took the coffee and he threw it off in the woods, and he said they were having tea. And a lot of people got really ticked off at him and didn't want to follow him. He was inflexible. His plans are no plans. I have a plan, I'm not going to divert from it, even though it's failing. He had a biting sarcasm that offended people regularly, especially his children. And the other thing was that he did not handle finances well. He said something, one of my favorite quotes from John Brown, and he said, I, early in my career, in my life, became convinced of the fact that a poor man had to have a line of credit to succeed in business, and that has kept me like a toad under a harrow all of my life. He says, I hope my children do not do that. But they did, and they had that problems too. They listened to Dad on that one when they shouldn't have. Now John Brown had virtues too. He was genuinely viewed African Americans and other races, Native Americans, as equals, and he was willing to fight and die for their freedom. He genuinely viewed women with respect and admiration, and viewed women with much more respect for their intellect and abilities than most men his age. He advocated more rights for women than most men did at the time, and he is viewed by many as an early feminist. And he was capable of great tenderness and caring. His children recall when they were sick, he was right there nursing them to health. And he was a very tender father for most of the time, except when they misbehaved. And he became the 19th century father. Now, why do we remember John Brown so much? One of the things that people do is they point to his violence, they point to this, and they point to that, and they say, why do we remember this man who killed so many people? And caused so many who were so violent? Well, in history, historians don't study people because they're fuzzy. Because we like them. We study people who change things. And John Brown changed things. He changed the world. He is world famous as a revolutionary and a civil rights pioneer. Another reason we remember him is he's a civil rights pioneer. If you talk to African Americans, they will list him as one of the first civil rights pioneers, people who started to work for civil rights. And also his raid on Harpers Ferry sparked the Civil War. Now, there are 4 basic opinions about John Brown. Believe me, in a day at the John Brown Museum, I will hear all of them at least twice, okay? Which is why I know what they are. I'm going to give you my 5th one. That's the academic one that I give. John Brown was a villain. If someone speaks with a southern accent, typically that's what will come out. John Brown was a crazy villain. He went and killed good people. If people like John Brown hadn't engaged in their violence and hadn't fought, we wouldn't have had a civil war and slaves would have been freed anyway. John Brown was a villain. That's the one. Yes, that's one of them. And now this is the most popular one. John Brown had a good cause, but he utilized morally wrong reasons to do it. He had a good idea, and he had a good cause, but he utilized wrong reasons, wrong means to end slavery. Then there's one. John Brown was a hero whose violence against pro-slavery forces was morally justifiable. I've had people walk up to me, and I've been leaning back as they were thumping me in the chest going, those people deserved it. That he can, yes sir. I'm going back, you know. I would have done the same thing if I was back then. Well, we're glad you came in. It's kind of what I didn't know. But no, but seriously, being dead serious, that is a point of view. Now, I said 5th, this is the 4th one. This is the academic view, and it's the one that I take. John Brown was an ideologically motivated guerrilla fighter who had all the strengths and weaknesses of an ideologically motivated guerrilla fighter, and who truly believed in the equality of African Americans and whites, and was willing to sacrifice his life if necessary for the equality and freedom of African Americans. Now, but no matter how he is viewed, John Brown's abolitionist crusade changed the course of world history. Now, I use world history because literally the first week that I worked at the John Brown Museum as a site administrator, about 10:30, a fella comes in, he shakes my hand, he says, I'm from the Czech Republic. And I said, wow. He says, we study this in our schools. We study John Brown in our schools. He's known as a great freedom fighter in Europe. And that has been echoed by Europeans who have come through. And John Brown's abolitionist crusade changed the world, and it was one of the sparks, not only for the Civil War, but for the Civil Rights movement. And I can tell you, my experience with African Americans when they come in the museum is uniformly that they view him as one of the few people who were willing to put their life on the line for their freedom and equality at a time when most people weren't. So John Brown did change the world, and he is a pivotal character. Are there any questions? Okay, well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.